welcome to another edition of the Paranormal Zone. I'm your co-host, Tom Spitalere. Bob's here with me. Hey, Bob, how we doing?
Good. How you doing tonight, Tom?
I'm doing great. We're getting through some nice, warm New England weather here for our friends across the great ocean. It's been near single digits here in New England, so it's warming up right in time for Christmas.
There you go.
The Paranormal Zone is set up so we can have different views on every week differently, from the paranormal to UFO to Bigfoot. You ever want to come on, you can email us at theparanormalzone.com. That, and not only that, today we're right near Christmas, so I want to wish everybody a very Merry Christmas, Happy Kwanzaa, happy whatever you celebrate. So thank you very much for tuning in on Christmas week. How about you, Bob? Wishing everybody out there?
Yeah, wishing everybody a happy holiday, Merry Christmas, and like you say, Tom, whatever you're celebrating in the next few days, I hope everybody has a healthy and happy New Year.
I do too. Speaking of that, before we get started today, this podcast is on its 43rd episode. Wow, can you believe it? Oof, 43 episodes. In order to keep this going, though, Lawrence Community Access TV has run into a wall of sorts. We're still being supported by the Lawrence community, but we're not being supported by the Lawrence politicians. So that means there's less money coming in. So in order to keep these podcasts going, we've had to launch a international fundraising campaign. If anybody loves our podcast and wants to donate to Lawrence Community Access TV so we can keep these podcasts going, please write out a check to Lawrence Community Access TV and mail it to 468 Essex Street, Lawrence, Mass. 01840. So with that, today we're going to speak about the Salem witch hysteria. Now, growing up here in the Merrimack Valley, we're in southern New Hampshire. We're what? I don't know, about 40 minutes to an hour, maybe max, of Salem, Massachusetts. Depending upon traffic. If you go at 8:30 in the morning, it could be an hour and a half ride. You go at 4:30 in the afternoon and you're trying to get home from Salem, it could be a 2-hour ride. So, but, we're pretty close. And Salem is in Haunted Essex County, so that's even better. So we're going to talk a little bit about what happened in Salem. So, Bob, why don't you take it away?
Yeah, the Salem witch trials have such interesting twists and turns when you talk about mysteries of what happened. I think there's a lot of misperceptions about the witch trials that we'll talk about tonight. For example, I don't think a lot of people, Tom, realize that the witch trials themselves took place between February of 1692 and May of 1693. So I think that people thought that the witch trials lasted years and years, which it didn't.
No.
The thing is, there were over 200 people accused of witchcraft in that time period. But interesting enough, there was only, which is a lot, I get, but there was really only 30 people actually convicted. So roughly 15% of people accused of witchcraft were actually found guilty.
Correct.
And that because I think perception, Tom, is that there were virtually hundreds and hundreds of people that were accused of witchcraft that were either hung or, burned at the stake and so forth, which again is kind of a misconception because most of them died in prison after their conviction, and there was only really a handful of them that were hung. So it's interesting, the misperception.
And one pressed to death. Don't forget the Giles Corey that was pressed to death.
Giles Corey, correct, was tortured and put to death by crushing, which would be, they would dig a kind of a shallow, I don't want to say grave, but a shallow opening, put the convicted witch in there and put planks over them. And then the townsfolk would come and put rocks on top of them. And they would keep piling rocks on top of the boards until, unfortunately, the witch was crushed, which was a terrible, terrible way to go, for sure. I think the other perception about the witch trials that is interesting to me is that most of them were really herbalists of their time. They healed people using herbs, which back then they could not comprehend.
Correct.
The second thing was that I believe in history we read a lot about this, that a lot of these witches that were convicted may have had mental illness that back then was not detected.
And that could have been from the food trays they were eating off of. That was silver and everything else, not just wood.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing, too, is the misconception was all women. It was not all women. There were men involved, albeit not a large number. But, out of the 30, I think 5 or 6 men were convicted of witchcraft. So it wasn't just women, albeit women outnumbered the men by quite a bit. I think there were 14 or 15 women and 5 or 6 men. So it's quite a story when you follow the whole thing. I think you brought up before that a lot of these convictions were in Andover, Topsfield, Reading. Not many right in the township of Salem.
No, but Salem was the county seat at the time. There was one convicted witch in Haverhill, Methuen, but Andover was the epicenter. And it's actually not Andover now. It was Andover then. It is now present-day North Andover. That's the real epicenter.
Right. And wasn't the trials themselves were held in downtown Salem, correct?
They were held in downtown Salem, and actually most of the convicted Salem people came from Salem Village, which is now Danvers, Massachusetts.
Ah, okay. All right. The other part about this, there was a religious factor, and I find it interesting that if we look at the Pilgrims, when they left England, they left because of religious discrimination. They wanted the right to believe in their own religion and practice that. And yet, when the colonies were formed, if you didn't fall in line with their religion, they kind of did the same thing that England did. They ostracized you. You were different. Why weren't you a Puritan? Why didn't you believe in their religious beliefs? So it was interesting how they kind of contradicted themselves in their culture, going from we want the right to freedom of religion to coming to this country, the new country, new world, and actually saying this is the religion you should follow.
Well, we gotta go back in time a little bit. Freedom of religion. Yeah. Okay? So when they arrived here, the early settlers, the Puritans, they believed in their freedom of religion, not freedom of religion. And the other thing that we also forget about one thing. Today we look at bread and go, "Ooh, it's got green dots on it. Let's throw it away. It's no good," right?
Right.
Well, guess what? Some of the bread that they used back then had a fungus called egg rot on it. ERGOT, if my memory serves me right, which caused illicit vomiting, choking, and fits of hallucinations.
Wow.
And feeling like crawling on the skin. The egg rot is actually is a derivative of LSD. What we know as LSD
really?
Today, yeah. So,
wow.
You have that going on. You have Tituba, who was the slave of the parishes there, and you had a weak minister, a very weak minister in Reverend Paris. He was not a strong minister at all.
Right.
And you also had a very religious culture here who, this guy was notorious, Reverend Cotton Mather. Now, we think of the Catholics, you got the Pope down in Rome, I hate to tell you, Reverend Cotton Mather and the Pope were two different people. The church hung more people in colonial times than the colonial government did for breaking colonial law.
Wow.
So, I mean, in 1697 was the Hannah Dustin incident. 1697-98, right? 1696, Elizabeth Emerson, Hannah's sister, is ordered hung by Reverend Cotton Mather for having 2 children out of wedlock that died. By her cousin, Stephen Emerson. Remember, it takes 2 to create a new child. Doesn't happen by immaculate conception. Only if you believe in the old adage of the Jedi Knight or something, where the mother, where the baby's carried and there's no father, no nothing, and the kid's born with these special abilities. So, if you believe that way too, which is, that's another story for another day. But it's interesting that Cotton Mather was the one who was supposed to be the high religious guy of New England. So you would think he would follow the Bible. Yeah, they followed the Bible right to the T back then, the Puritan Bible.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. I think that whole aspect of it, Tom, is a story unto itself. Because again, when you look at why they left England to begin with, it was because they wanted to practice their religion.
Right.
And yet when they got here, they wanted everyone else to practice their religion along with them.
Their religion, so correct.
Yeah, that's right. And what happens is that witches that were herbalists, at least, didn't follow their religion. They're very similar to witches today. When we had Reverend Mary Mother on, I don't know, a couple months ago, we talked about the religious aspect of witches. And their religion is as strong as the Catholic religion, Protestant religion, other than they worship nature. That's what they worship. They worship the trees and the sun and the stars and the moon and the nighttime and stuff like that. But their beliefs are just as strong. And by the way, they don't not believe in organized religion like Catholic, Protestants, Jewish people. They believe in a lot of those aspects. It's not that they discount that completely.
Right.
It's just that dedicate themselves to nature.
Right.
So it's pretty interesting.
Well,
again, I think... Yeah, go ahead.
The other thing that was going on, too, is let's look at the first one that they accused of being a witch. Rebecca Nurse. Single lady, a mature woman, meaning older, much older. She was accused, and what they were she was accused by family members and in-laws that would end up being her accusers.
Right.
That almost started looking like a land grab for some people.
Right.
Women can't own land. Now they own land because their husband died, and my family don't have that money. We need the land, so
Correct.
A little hallucinogens here, a little of this, a little of that, and a hysteria breaks loose.
Sure, and hysteria is a great word because it was probably a time between 1692 and May of 1693. It was probably a time that hysteria took over in this country in a movement that we've never seen before. And we certainly have had war after war to think about it. But the hysteria took over because nobody understood it. Even people that stepped back in those days, and there were dissenting voters about witchcraft. There certainly was people that did not believe that they were witches and that their trials and convictions were unfounded. Mm-hmm. But those people were very few and in between and really didn't push their agenda too far because they were afraid of being accused of witchcraft to get them out of the way.
Correct.
So the courts and the people running the colonies used this as a weapon as much as a tool.
Correct.
Right? And there were cases where spouses, accuse their spouse of witchcraft only to dispose of them.
Yeah, I mean, that happened too. I mean, that's why, and I mean, today in courts they don't use spectral evidence. Back then
Correct.
they used spectral evidence.
Right,
Because
exactly.
if they use spectral evidence today, imagine how many other cases might have been solved.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's a great point. Absolutely. Again, I think that if people are interested in this, there's a lot of research out there that goes much deeper into it than we can get into it tonight because it has so many twists and turns to it.
Yeah, every time you turn around, there was a twist and a turn.
Yeah, I mean, frankly, if somebody didn't act exactly like they were supposed to act, witchcraft came onto the table. If in one case somebody's walking, got people walking by a cottage, they hear strange voices inside,
right?
And there's only one person inside, so they think this person is talking to, the devil, if you will, and they're charged with witchcraft over that. I mean, when you think about that, it's just an amazing thing when you look at the laws today. Mm-hmm. This wouldn't even end up in an arrest.
No. And on June 2nd, Bridget Bishop, who was accused 12 years earlier, before the witch hysteria of Salem, was one of the first defendants to be convicted on June 10th. She was hanged in what would become known as Gallows Hill, now Gallows Hill Park. And then on July 19th, 5 more convicted people were hanged, including Rebecca Nurse Good. So, I mean, this just continued.
Right. And I think the first one was, or at least the one that's documented. Because the other thing, too, Tom, that as we look back in history, in the 1600s, there were a lot of cases not documented at all. What I don't think accounts in history's numbers is a lot of people that were accused of witchcraft would sit in these dungeons, frankly, for 6 months or a year before they were even tried. Right. And a lot of them never made it to trial. They went deceased while they were being held.
Right. And then,
so they don't account into those numbers.
No, and then the former minister, George Burroughs, who served as minister of Salem Village in 1680 to 83, was summoned from his new home in Maine, accused of being a witch, the witch's ringleader, and he too was convicted with 4 others and hanged on August 19th as he recited the Lord's Prayer while he was being hung.
Right.
So, I mean,
Yeah.
And then you have the minister hiding, doing absolutely nothing at all.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Cotton Mather, his role in the trial was he should have been condemned and hung himself by the time this was over.
Exactly.
He did absolutely nothing. The holiest of the holiest of New England.
Right. And all of them, Mather, and all of them, the judges and even the trial lawyers and the people that were accusing them, they all had very sordid pasts themselves. Adultery and child abuse and everything else that was never even brought forth in those days. So that contradicts the religious part of it. It was okay to do that, but God forbid, don't be a witch.
Right. I mean, and as these things progressed, I mean, this got out of control. I mean, you have Beverly, Malden, Gloucester, Andover, Lynn, Marblehead, Charlestown. And then, of course, like I said earlier, Haverhill, Methuen now, but was Haverhill at that time. But the area is down with one of the Tenney family members.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and in the Salem, in the initial accusations, there were really, I can't remember, you might remember their names. There were 4 young girls involved that had been charged with witchcraft who quickly caught on to the fact that if you would admit to being a witch, your sentencing was much less than if you fought it. If you fought it through the whole trial, the chances are you'd be definitely convicted and either sentenced to hang or, again, die in prison. But the 4 girls, I'm trying to think, Abigail Williams, Ann Putnam Jr.,
right,
and a girl named Elizabeth Hubbard. They were accused of witchcraft and was sentenced, and part of their conviction was that they agreed to testify against other witches. So they believed that these 4 girls were just accusing and testifying against other witches with absolutely no evidence whatsoever.
Right.
And at the end of the witch trials, this came to being after 1693, and the 4 girls admitted to the fact that they had no evidence that what went on during trial, that they said the witch was making them convulse and so forth, was absolutely false. It was all made up.
Right.
So those 4 girls had a lot to do at the beginning and a lot of convictions.
Right, and Abigail Williams was 11, Ann Putnam Jr. was 12.
I mean, girls themselves. Betty Paris, 9 years old.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, and they did it all to avoid being punished themselves.
Right.
Because they realized they weren't guilty. But it's too bad that they became part of the problem, not the solution.
Right, and Samuel Parris was no hero either, because he was a merchant from Boston. He could read. That's why they needed him. And he made money shipping, and he was the one that brought Tituba over to Salem. And he shrewdly put his contract together for the town of Salem. You know, because he was lousy as he was not a great merchant, Samuel Parris. So he was losing everything. So he figured, well, I can read the Bible. Oh, that makes me a minister. Well, no, it really doesn't make you anything except you can read the Bible. So he brought his wife, his 3 children, a niece, 2 slaves. Imagine a minister with 2 slaves.
Right.
John Indian, the man, and Tituba, the woman. And they were from Barbados.
Wow. Yeah. It just goes on. We talk a lot about in New Hampshire. The first witch of New Hampshire was Goody Cole, and you and I have made this presentation many times. Goody Cole was in and out and started in Massachusetts. Was convicted in Massachusetts for being a witch. And she was really an herbalist. She healed people through different plants and stuff. After her convictions in Massachusetts, she moved to Hampton Falls, New Hampshire, where she was the first convicted witch of New Hampshire for basically the same thing. So what happened to these people, even if they tried to move out of that particular colony to start over again, it followed them.
Yeah, she was tried in witchcraft in 1656 and again in 1673. She was sentenced for life, and then she was petitioned to take care of her aging husband and was released. And then the town selectmen ordered the inhabitants to take turns supporting Goody Cole for 1 week at the end, at the time of 1671. She was again arraigned on charges of witchcraft. By 1673, she was found not guilty.
Right, not guilty. So it's again, and she went down in history as the first convicted witch of New Hampshire. Right. But again, she had been convicted prior to that in Massachusetts. Yes. But again, Tom, it only lasted that short period of time. Now, for the witches convicted, it lasted a lifetime. I get that. I'm not being cold to that situation. But I think that the Salem witch trials especially, and of course there was the Connecticut witch trials that took place also, that we in New England don't spend a lot of time talking about because of Salem. But, what these poor folks went through was just a terrible ordeal, whether they were guilty or not. And I think it's to some degree that there was paranormal activity back then.
Correct.
I think paranormal activity has been in the picture since pre-Egyptian times. But so some of these witches must have had some contact with the paranormal. And there were people back in 1693 that absolutely believed in the paranormal and believed that you couldn't believe in the birth of Jesus and the death of Jesus if you didn't believe in the paranormal.
Correct.
Right? Because if you believe Jesus rose from the dead, well, he becomes what we know as a ghost, right? So
correct.
They believed in paranormal back then, and yet not all these witches were necessarily tied to that.
No, you're right. You're right about that, Bob.
Yeah, I knew it was neighbors. You know, like you said, there was land grabs going on. There were neighbors and politicians that wanted certain farmlands, wanted more farmlands than they had, or their neighbor's property. So it didn't take a lot to make an accusation. Now, again, when we look at the number accused, the number convicted, 15% conviction rate is pretty low.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
I mean, you know, if you looked at our standards today at a DA in any state, that's a pretty low conviction rate of 15%.
No, you're right about that. That is very low.
However, I think that the atrocity was that out of the 15%, the 20 or so that were convicted, how many of them were really guilty?
Right, and how many of them that were hung or pressed to death really deserved it?
Yeah. I mean, the numbers keep dwindling down to where there was a lot of people that were, you know, executed that probably did nothing wrong at all, maybe, besides being a little different than their peers.
Yeah, you're right about that, Bob.
So,
it's sad.
But
that is a dark mark on New England history. It always has been.
Yeah, it sure is. It's almost similar to what happened in American history to the American Indian, who, again, go back to Puritan times when the American Indian accepted Puritans into their culture, tried to teach them how to farm and raise crops and feed themselves and everything else. And then over the course of 100 years, 200 years, all we did was take their land from them and keep reducing where they could live. Because
correct.
we didn't believe in their religious beliefs, or we didn't believe in the way that they conducted themselves. And again, I always think, Tom, which is pretty, I don't know, I think there's an analogy between witches and Indians. Because if you look at the American Indian, they had a culture and a belief in gods that didn't necessarily align itself with religious beliefs.
That is correct.
Right? I mean, so they worship differently, they sacrifice differently. They were very much like witches in that they respected the animals and nature, you know, more than just a religious type god.
No, you're right about that. And, you know, and it scared some of the Puritans, because the Puritans didn't understand what was going on.
Correct. And again, the Puritans really believed in their hearts, and I believe that it was well-intended, but they believed in their hearts that their religious beliefs was the only way to go. I mean, you know, I often talk about the Sandown Meeting House, and when on Sundays, when people would travel miles, sometimes on foot, sometimes on horseback or carriage, with children in tow and everything else, they worshipped all day long. I mean, it wasn't like today where we go to a Mass, regardless of the religious aspects, and it lasts 45 minutes to an hour, and frankly, we don't go back to Mass for another week or so.
Right, exactly. And you're complaining that it lasts an hour. Some people complaining it lasts an hour.
Right. I mean, if you grew up Catholic like I did, the worst thing that you went through was what they called back then a high Mass. And that Mass, even back then, was done in Latin.
I've been to a few of those.
Yeah, and you knew that was an hour to an hour and 15 with no problem at all.
No.
If you went in and they were doing a regular Mass, it was under an hour for the most part.
I've been to an Armenian high Mass when my cousin passed away. It was almost a 2-hour Mass.
Oh, yeah. I mean, so you look back in colonial times, they worshipped all day long. It became a whole event. Right? So, again, when you look at religion has played a big part in our lives from the conception.
Right, and it was a whole day worth of religion because if we go back to the historic Sandown Meeting House, there's what was called what we would call outhouses in the back. I call them industrial outhouses. There's about 6 of them in one building with stalls between them, 6 or 8 stalls, all the way it would have been back in 1700s when they were doing services there.
Yeah, that's correct. That's an original outhouse in the back. You and I have looked at it many times. It really is just a lot of boards set up in a cubicle with a hole in the middle of it. That's exactly what it was.
Right, there's about 6 or 7 cubicles in there, which I've never seen before. I've never seen an outhouse that big.
Yeah, no, that's true. Because the Sandown Meeting House was really served a lot of communities because the geographical layout of the Sandown, Hampstead, Plastow areas was much different than it is today. A matter of fact, I believe Haverhill at one point was part of that.
Haverhill went all the way. When Haverhill was settled, there was nothing north, west, east. There was some stuff. So anything north and northwest, Plastow, Sandown, Atkinson, that whole area out to 111 where Caniford's is. Oh, sorry, Hannaford's. That area all the way out there was all settled in Haverhill. In fact, some of the work that we have been doing with we'll get off topic for 1 second only, but I mean the beehive in Sandown. There are multiple beehives in the whole area out there, and of course, it's not nearly as old as America's Stonehenge. So what are those things doing out there? And then you got Stonehenge. So that's a story for another show.
Sure.
But as far as the area is concerned, that's why these meeting houses had to be big. I mean, Haverhill had the East Parish, the West Parish, and then the North Parish meeting houses. One's in Rocks Village, still standing today. That's the Whittier Meeting House. That's one of and the other one is actually, the other ones are not standing, but the old churches that they had the meetings in Bradford still stand. But the Whittier Meeting House is the only one left standing in Haverhill.
Yeah, exactly. Well, back to witches again, I've often wondered this, and all the research that you and I have done over many, many years, I've never found the answer to this question. And maybe some of our listeners can send us an email at paranormalnh@yahoo.com and address this. But I wonder, Tom, why the accusations and ultimately convictions of witches didn't go further north into New Hampshire to any great degree. I mean, if you look at the Goody Cole situation She migrated after being convicted and released from prison in Mass, migrated to New Hampshire.
Right.
But you don't hear a lot of history about witches in New Hampshire north of Sandown.
Correct. And you also don't go too far up. You had George Burroughs, that was the minister in Salem, was summoned back and then later hung for witchcraft. But if he didn't come back and follow the summons, he probably would have been left alone up in Maine, for all we know. And this goes back to the leadership. When you have weak leadership, so you had Reverend Parris, who as a historian, I don't even want to call him a reverend. He was a merchant. Yeah. That's all he was. A merchant. A failed merchant who needed money. Right. So he used his influence and got himself a job as a minister.
Right.
And pretty much was a very weak minister.
Right.
The reason why it didn't take place in New Hampshire is because when they tried it with Goody Cole, a minister stepped in and said, enough is enough. We're not going to have another Salem. We're stopping this now.
Correct.
You had a very weak minister who curtailed everybody in town because he couldn't lose that job.
Right. And I think people need to understand back then that ministers were extremely important people because of the religious aspect in the 1690s.
They were the most powerful people in the village or in the town.
That's correct.
Or in the friar, whatever you want to call it.
Right, because the governors fell in line with the religious aspect of it. So they wouldn't go up against their reverends like that because they were afraid of them.
Right, exactly.
Right?
I mean, we lived, and I hate to use this word, but we lived in a God-fearing society back then. And like I said earlier, Cotton Mather, the high priest of New England, the all-exalted one, had more people hung than our colonial government hung.
Right. Yeah, it's an interesting tale for sure because it covers so many things. But again, it's interesting to me that you don't hear a lot about witchcraft in Maine. You don't hear a lot of, historical witchcraft. I'm talking about.
Right.
You don't hear a lot about north of Plastow necessarily, north of Sandown, Vermont. You don't hear a lot about witchcraft. It seems to be centralized around the Salem area, which lends itself to be the hysteria theory that once it started, nobody really could step in and stop it.
Right, exactly.
Right, it just kept catching on and growing and growing and growing until May 1693 or so, somebody stood up and said, that's it, it's over. This is ridiculous. We're just charging people with really not a fair trial.
Correct. And this historian named Dr. Peony actually said the only crime that Eunice Cole, Goody Cole, was simply being, the only crime that she committed was simply being unlikable.
Well, yeah, that's the other aspect of people being accused of witches, both men and women. If you were different in the community and you weren't liked by the whole community, it was, eventually somebody was going to charge you with witchcraft.
Right.
And by the way, your accuser, could have been a down and out, not very prominent person in the town. It didn't take the governor, the reverend, a preacher, or anything else to be the accuser.
Right, and the other one from New Hampshire, the one we don't talk about much, and I don't know why we don't talk about her. You don't see any markers or anything. Another well-known accuser was Rachel Fuller, also in Hampton. She was accused of witchcraft in 1680 after a local child died. Apparently, Fuller had visited the child prior to the death and acted quite strangely during her visit. She subsequently was brought to Dover for trial and was held in jail with a 100-pound bond. But the court decided to release her, and she was later acquitted of all charges.
Wow. Yeah. And the other aspect of that is we know that an accused witch, I think this is going to be interesting to our listeners, because if a witch was accused and was willing to stand in front of the court and say, yes, I am a witch, he or she actually received a lesser sentence than somebody who stood there and said they were innocent and forced a whole trial, and the whole trial might be two witnesses.
Exactly.
But almost all of them that went through the whole trial ended up in prison and or executed.
Right.
So it would be similar in today's legal system that if you had two murderers, one murderer said, okay, I did it, I shouldn't have, I'm sorry, would get a couple of years in prison, but the other murderer that went to trial and was convicted by a jury would get an execution or a life. I mean, it really just made no sense. It wasn't based on the crime. It was based on the admission of the crime.
Correct.
You know? So, of course, back then they didn't understand the law, because the law was what? The law was whatever they decided it to be.
Like I said earlier, and I'll stay by this, there were more people put in trouble, hung, put in jail by puritanical law than colonial law. That's just amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, that's true, Tom. And you know, I say to people all the time, why is history important? You're a historian, an educated historian, so you understand this, that if you don't understand history and you don't understand the faults in history, and all historical events have had faults, there's no doubt about that. But if you don't understand the faults, we're destined to repeat them.
That's so true. It's not even funny. I mean, instead of learning from history, people want to change it. For example, recently, it's quieted down, but recently they wanted to remove all the monuments. They did remove a lot of our war monuments in the South and in the North. Anything that was controversial. Let's not learn from what happened during the Civil War. Let's just wipe it out and rewrite history. Let's not learn from World War I. Oh, hey, man, I'm sorry, no disrespect to my great-uncles that served in World War I or your family. The real World War I. King Philip, King William and Mary, King George's War. Let's learn from that, because colonists wiped out Native Americans, and Native Americans wiped out colonists. Let's learn from it. Let's not rewrite it. Let's learn from it so we don't wipe each other out down the road again.
Sure, and you know what? It cracks me up when people say that, because it's an oxymoron. You can't rewrite history. you can ignore history,
right?
But you can't rewrite it.
No,
it's already happened. There's no going back and rewriting it.
Right.
And you know, when we look at the South again, when we look at the witches' trials in Salem, albeit a year or so it took place, if you looked at the discrimination down south for slaves, was terrible.
Correct.
And it lasted 100 years. And I don't think there's anybody on the planet that I talk to would ever want to see that happen again under any circumstances.
Correct.
But if you don't understand how it happened and why it happened, then how do you correct it from happening again? Because you don't see the signs of that. So we as a culture, all of us, whether you're black, you're white, you're Hispanic, it doesn't matter. We should encourage those kind of historical monuments and stuff so that we're constantly looking at that. And I know we're off topic here a little bit, but it does tie back to the witch trial. If you looked at Hitler, okay, and what he did to the Jews was such an atrocity. But we have to understand that. We don't have to applaud it, agree with it, or worship it for that matter, Tom. But we need to understand it so that as we see it happening or about to happen, we can stop it before it really happens. I think to ignore it, we're going to find ourselves someday in the same situation as the American Indian or the blacks in the South, which was terrible, or on and on and on with things that have happened. Vietnam, World War I, World War II. Certainly Hitler may have been the biggest atrocities of history, maybe. The people and the number of people that he killed, all in the line of superiority, frankly. But we need to understand that so we can identify the Hitlers that are coming to us, and they're coming. But if people think that the day of Hitler is over, it's not.
No.
We're destined to see another Hitler in this world of ours. Depending on your age, who knows if you'll see it or I'll see it, but it's coming. And if you don't recognize it, it will be here and take over faster. I doubt that most people, when Hitler was put in power, I bet most people never realized what he was capable of doing at that point.
No, they were not.
But once he got the power, you couldn't take it back from him. So the key to that is stop the power before he gets it.
Correct. And that's why things go down. And
don't forget, Tom, the women's movement follows this a little bit. It's not as violent, thank God. But if you go back to the 40s and 50s, women didn't vote. They did not vote. And people say, oh, that couldn't be. Yeah, it was. They did not vote. And it took women lots of sacrifices to get, and lots of years of fighting and picketing and begging to get the right just to vote.
Right.
That should never happen in our country ever again.
No. And getting back...
Because of the...
Yeah,
go ahead.
No, finish up what you were going to say, Bob.
No, I say that if you don't understand what happened back then you'll never recognize it if it happens again.
Correct. And here's a very sad thing about the Salem trials. Back to the Salem trials.
Yep.
During the Salem witch trials, 19 people were hanged. 1 man was pressed to death. 5 died in prison, including an infant. In total, 150 people were arrested. Over 200 were accused. And since the victims were found guilty of a religious crime, the memorial in Salem today is not a grave. It's no more than... in fact, no one knows where their bodies are buried. And I'm going to actually slip from that 1 second. One of them, and I'm the first one, the older lady. What was her name? In Massachusetts, not Goody Cole.
Yeah, I can't remember right now.
Her body was actually dug up and moved to the family graveyard at the museum in Danvers. Right.
Goody Cole, when she died in Hampton, they actually took her body out of her cottage, dug a hole in the front of the cottage, and buried her right then and there. Mm-hmm. With a stake through her heart.
Right.
Because townspeople said she was obsessed by the devil. They have never found that grave. They know the general vicinity of it, but they never did find it. But in 2004, she was exonerated by the legislature in New Hampshire of all charges.
Correct, and in Massachusetts, in the last 5 or 6 years, a lot of, thanks to the work of, then she was senator, state senator, Diana DeZoglio. Now she's our state auditor. She actually had a few. She actually got them exonerated. If you did find a witch's grave and they were exonerated early on, their death date is the date of their exoneration, not the day they were actually the day they actually died.
Right. Yeah, and I think too that we forget about the families that were attached to the witches. Maybe they weren't all married with children, but they had a mother and father. They had brothers and sisters
Cousins, aunts, uncles,
cousins and relatives and everything else that nobody ever thinks about. But imagine the pain, anguish, and embarrassment that their families went through.
No, you're right about that.
Right, because their daughter or their sister or their aunt or whatever was accused of, back then, the worst crime you could commit. It was a crime of partnering up with Satan. That's what it was all about. They believed back then that witches were possessed by the devil and dark forces. Right? So that was the thrust of the whole thing. It wasn't that they were just acting weird. They were acting weird and doing strange things because the townsfolk accused them of being obsessed or possessed by the devil. Yet these people had families, and they loved them. They raised them. Goody Cole, for example, was a baby at one point. She was a child at one point, raised by parents. Accused and convicted at a young age of witchcraft. So she had family in the area. She had people that loved her, and they had to go through that, which had to be a terrible, terrible thing when we think today what it's like if one of our children or our brothers, our sisters, whoever, are accused of a crime and put in prison. The heartache that the family goes through is unbelievable, and yet most of the time we neglect to think about the family because the crime itself is what takes precedence.
No, you're right about that, and that's what's sad about a lot of this.
Yeah, it is. I mean, not to shift gears too much, but if you look at this recent CEO killing in New York, this guy that did the shooting, allegedly did the shooting, he has a mother and father that by the way, are very wealthy. He didn't come from a poverty home. He didn't come from a home of a broken home or anything else. He came from a home that there is a lot of money there. And people can argue, well, that's why he was gifted and he got everything. Well, okay, we can have that conversation. But that doesn't mean that his mother and father didn't love him and that they're not going through a painful time watching their son accused of a terrible crime. And in my eyes, he'll be convicted. I think the evidence is very strong against him. But again, I think about the families back with the witches that were burned. There were certainly spouses involved that loved their spouse, didn't want to see their spouse convicted of witchcraft, but was afraid to stand up and be counted because they'd be charged with witchcraft.
Right.
So imagine, Tom, what that was like, sitting back in a courtroom watching your spouse face to be hung, and you don't have enough courage or a voice to say, wait a minute, that's not fair. I mean, they didn't have representation. They represented themselves in most cases.
Correct.
Right?
Yep.
So, they didn't have the luxury of a lawyer.
No,
they represented themselves. So, just a terrible tragedy. Terrible.
Just to add to this a little bit, right? Joseph, the great-grandson, Joseph Holton, an important landowner in Salem who had a documented role in the Salem witch hysteria, his family founded Holton, Maine.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah.
Now, did I don't know if you know the history of it, but did the family move out because of that?
No, some of the family actually defended Rebecca Nurse. They were relatives of the Rebecca Nurse. And it split the family into two.
Wow. believers and non-believers.
And Rebecca Nurse was the one whose body was dug up and buried at the family grave plot. That's who it was. I drew a blank for a minute.
Yeah. Well, that's another aspect of the witches trials that nobody talks about is families were pitted against each other.
Right.
Right?
John Holton, Jonathan Welcock were also accused of witchcraft. John Holton, that one from Holton, Maine. Here's some of the other ones, too. These were from the Andovers. Nehemiah Abbott, Arthur Abbott, John Alden, Matthew Carrier, John Flood, Elizabeth Fosdick, Elizabeth Howe. That's the one from the Havel, Methuen area. William Proctor, Wilmot Reed, Sarah Rice. Mary Toothaker was also from Havel. Her descendant is a very close friend of mine. But she was cleared and released in 1693. Red was executed. The other ones were all arrested for it.
Yeah. You know what we got to do for our listeners? We have to do some research into this because without giving out first names, Toothaker is a very good friend of mine. Now, I'm sure it's not the same Toothaker, but I'm very friendly with a very prominent family in the area named Toothaker. But I'm thinking, Tom, for a future podcast, we should think about researching the descendants of these witches and see if we can't find one that was alive today that's a descendant of in the line, and to come on the podcast and talk about that.
We could actually.
Yeah.
That would actually be a good thing.
As we wrap up the show tonight, I just want to take a few minutes to encourage our listeners to send us an email at paranormalnh@yahoo.com. Tell us what you think about the program. We want to know what your recommendations are for different types of shows. We're looking for guests to come on. These are all things that you can communicate with us through paranormalnh@yahoo.com. And to begin with, you don't have to give me names or locations or anything else. But we encourage people to give us feedback on these programs, good, bad, or ugly. We're big boys here. We can take it. So if you've got criticism, come on the show. Send me an email. Let's talk about it. This really isn't a one-way show. This is meant to give a voice to the paranormal community, but it's also meant to give our listeners an education and knowledge of what's going on. If you disagree with something we've said on air, send me an email. Let's talk about it. We'd be happy to have you on and tell us what your point of view is.
Exactly.
Go ahead.
Also, too, if there's anybody listening that wants to come on, email us at paranormalnh.com, and we'll be more than happy to have you on the air, too.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to close with tonight is that the appeal for fundraising for the podcast and the TV program in Lawrence, public television, public radio, and everything is very important. Very important because it's ad-free. And it's here in your community for you. So if you have any fundraising ideas that you would like to share with us, send something to paranormalnh@yahoo.com. We're willing to talk about any kind of an event that you might want us to do. And we share in the fundraising, or we do it all for Lawrence Public Television. But either way, we need to communicate with our listeners. It's very important that we understand what kind of programming and what you think of the program as is. So, we don't expect anything tonight or tomorrow with Christmas, but we certainly think in the next week or two, you should give us some feedback as to these kind of podcasts. And I'll close tonight, Tom, if you don't mind, just wishing all of our listeners a very Merry Christmas. I hope that the next few days and New Year's Eve is healthy and happy for you and your family, and we wish you nothing but the best.
All right, good night, everybody. And Bob, we have one more show before next year, so we don't want to confuse.
Yeah, listen, I just want to make a comment here. I don't expect anything, but the next show is on my birthday.
Oh, all righty. That'll be a fun one.
Yeah, so if our listeners want to send me a new car, a new boat, I'm not choosy about colors or makes and models, I appreciate the gift. You can just buy it and send it to my home. I'll give you the address.
All right. Thank you, Bob. I want to thank
Good night, everybody.
Good night. Wish you all a very Merry Christmas. And make sure you keep those chocolate chip cookies and milk out for Santa. Good night, everybody.